Greetings. The Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra free online course continues. I've taken a break for a little while from these videos to let people get caught up. And now we're continuing. And this online free course, which appears on Facebook and YouTube, began over a year ago now. And we're about 41% of the way through the text. So assuming we continue all the way to the end, this online free course will be over 2 years in length. And that's an in-depth course, of course. It's more in-depth, I believe, than anything that's been offered on this text publicly in the English-speaking world. And really, to be honest, this is about as short as I could make it while still doing justice to these verses and this Sanskrit text. So it could have been longer if we explored other possible commentaries and other possible interpretations in more depth. But, you know, over 2 years, or roughly, I don't know what it comes out to. I'm not so good at math. Maybe 300 hours. It's pretty much about as short as I could make it. So as we're beginning again after a hiatus, I want to take a special moment to thank all the patrons on Patreon that make this course and others possible. The monthly support, the regular support I receive from those patrons that I can count on means that I'm not only am able to offer content to them, the patrons on Patreon, but also able to offer free content to the world. And indeed, thousands of people from all over the world watch these videos, both on Facebook and YouTube. So if you know anyone who's read any version of the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, from the version in Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, to Osho's Book of Secrets, to the Radiance Sutras, to the Jaidev Singh version, please recommend this course to them, because so far, every single person I've talked to has found that it is much more comprehensible and also much more precise than any of those renderings, versions, or translations out there so far. And that's the feedback I've received. I'm grateful for it. So let's continue. We're in the section of the text, the module, if you will, on bliss practices, practices that bring ananda, joy or bliss. And there's maybe, I want to say 7 or 8 more verses on this topic before we get into daily life practices. Which is itself a very fascinating topic. So now we're on verse 67, and that goes as follows. Sarvasroto nibandhena prāṇa-śakti-dvayāshanaihi pipila sparsha velayam pratate paramam sukham. The practitioner who stops all the streams of prāṇa-śakti, life force energy, from flowing out through the senses and the orifices, will experience that prāṇa-śakti entering the central channel and slowly rising upward. In time, he or she will experience a sensation like the crawling of ants on the skin. And then unsurpassed pleasure or happiness manifests. Paramam sukham. Okay, so I have to be honest. I think it's important always for teachers of these materials to be thoroughly honest and transparent, in the sense that in this particular verse, it's referring to an experience I haven't had, and it's also referring to a practice that I haven't much done a little bit, but not much. So I'm going to defer in the Facebook group anyway, I'm going to defer to others who may have more expertise on this matter. I know there are those in the Facebook group who are familiar with what is sometimes called Mahakumbhaka, achieving this sort of breath retention and retention of prāṇa-śakti that can bring dramatic results in yogic practice, which I've never felt motivated to try and achieve. I have practiced quite a bit of pranayama, but never the more strenuous and vigorous and intense or difficult types, which I was advised by several respected gurus can, if misapplied, bring about derangement of mind or body, or so-called prana diseases. So I didn't feel like risking that, but also intensive pranayama just never drew me as a practice. But I feel fairly confident in interpreting the verse, partially because I looked at Shivopadhyayā's Sanskrit commentary, and the commentary makes it explicitly clear that this verse is all about pranayama and kumbhaka. And that's assuming, of course, that we trust the commentator's reading, trust that he's got the verse right. Because the verse itself is quite elliptical, meaning it omits a lot. It just gives this little allusion to what's going on. Allusion with an A. So let's look at it again. Sarvasroto nibandhena, the practitioner who stops all the streams prāṇa-śakti or of prāṇa-śakti from flowing out through the senses and orifices. The grammar here is a little bit strange, but that's really the only interpretation that makes sense. So the practitioner who stops the streams of life force energy from flowing out through the senses and orifices will experience it urdhvaya shanaihi, rising upward. Experience it with a slow upward rise. And then comes an occasion, vela, a moment, an occasion in this process where he experiences or she experiences something like pipila sparsha, the feeling of ants crawling on your skin. And the technical term for this in English is formication. Not to be confused with fornication. Formication with an M is the sensation of insects crawling on your skin when no insects are there. And indeed, in sensory deprivation, in long-term meditation retreats, and in prolonged kumbhaka, people do experience this phenomenon. And indeed, some in the Facebook group have testified to this very experience in a thread I started about it a couple weeks back. Formication. Now, very few of those people, however, attest to a subsequent experience of supreme pleasure or happiness or joy, which the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra tells us should occur. So I don't know if that's a matter of, the text does not specify whether this paramam sukham, this supreme pleasure, should manifest immediately after the formication or sometime later. There's no specification there. Okay, so again, I'll defer to others who might know more about this, but just to say a little bit about what we find in the commentary. Right here, our commentator, Shivopadhyaya, Sanskrit commentator writing several centuries ago, actually has quite a bit more to say than he does on other verses. Perhaps he was personally had a lot of experience with pranayama, I don't know. But he cites a couple of verses, somewhat surprisingly, from the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, or Patanjala Yoga Shastra, specifically verses 2.49 and 2.50, which of course are sutras not verses technically, sutras on pranayama in the Yoga Sutra, 2.49 and 50. And he discusses pranayama at some length. He talks about first blocking the sense orifices, right, as well as you can. So whether you're wearing blindfolds, earplugs, you're blocking all the sense orifices as well as you can. You are attempting to bring about a kind of sensory deprivation in this practice. Okay, and then he talks about, before kind of engaging in the pranayama, doing the practice of yukti number 1 of this text, or some variation on it. Indeed, he mentions the variation of inhaling all the way down to the base or root chakra, the adhara or muladhara, and exhaling all the way up to the dwadashanta. So that is a more strenuous or challenging version of yukti number 1, in the sense that the length of the inhale and exhale is longer. Just looking at the Sanskrit here. Right. Okay. He says it doesn't much matter if the base center that you're working with is at the pelvic floor or at the khanda, so-called secret chakra, in between Swadhisthana and Manipura. And then he talks about, the key terms of pranayama. He defines them. Puraka, a deep inhale, a long, slow filling of the lungs. Rejaka, an exhale or emptying. And kumbhaka, retaining or pausing the breath after a long inhale or after a long exhale. And the antar kumbhaka, the inner kumbhaka, pausing the breath after a long inhale, is considered more important here, and in most branches of the tradition. It allows you to pull the prāṇa-śakti into, if done properly, into the central channel. And the commentator talks about a couple of tests, parikshas, or litmus tests, one might say, diagnostic exams, that how you know that you have accomplished something with the practice. So he talks about the desha pariksha, the test of place, which is where, if I'm reading him right, one is able to do this practice of inhale and exhale in its fullest possible extent, and also pause the breath for long periods of time. Actually, no, sorry, that's the next test, the test of time. So the test of place is that you can extend the breath as fully to its full extent, right? So unlike where we started in this text, breathing between the heart and the point above the head, now breathing all the way down to the base and all the way up in this long, slow way, that if you're also doing breath retention, is fairly challenging. So then there's the test of time, and this is where you do breath retention for long enough that you achieve 3 udgatas. And udgata means when the breath is paused and the prāṇa-śakti is pulled into the central channel, it suddenly surges upwards from around the navel or the khanda and strikes the inside of the crown of the head sufficiently forcibly that the body does a little jump all by itself, right? It's not udgata if you make the body jump. It's the surge upwards of energy whereby the body then goes, pops up and up a bit from the force of the energy rising up the central channel. So our commentator says you should have 3 udgatas before the practice is complete. First is a gentle one, then there's a medium one, then there's an intense one. And that intense one, is really unmistakable, where the energy really strikes the inside of the crown of the head very, very forcibly, and the whole body visibly lifts off the cushion. Okay, and these udgatas are, in a sense, imitated in Tibetan yoga, Trulkor, and I'm not really qualified to say more about that, but others might be able to add something. Okay, so there's more. There's, the commentator says quite a bit about these pranayama practices, and more than I feel qualified to comment on. But there, I've shared some with you from the commentary. And so the idea is, following this sort of standard model that not everyone's experience corresponds to, is that through this breath retention, you and pulling all the energy into the central channel, you experience sooner or later this formication, and then paramam sukham, ideally, supreme happiness. Okay, so that's all I really could say about this particular verse. Let's see, Ashton adds in the live comments window, for those of you watching live, which is not most of you, he says, in my experience, it comes like a wave, the tingly skin sensations, then a wave of bliss. Uncontrollable smiling, laughter, sometimes tears of joy, and definitely an upward wave of sensation. Thank you, Ashton, for sharing that. Yeah, that certainly sounds similar, and I think there's going to be a number of experiences that are in the ballpark, that are maybe not exactly what the text is talking about, but maybe in the ballpark is after all the idea. Because indeed in the commentary it says a sensation like crawling ants, similar to, doesn't have to be exactly that. Some people do actually feel, oh, there's bugs on me, and they actually interrupt their practice and look down to discover no bugs. But for other people, it's not exactly like that, but rather these tingly skin sensations. I've experienced those as well. But this, what Ashton's talking about, this uncontrollable smiling, laughter, wave of bliss, tears of joy, that when it arises spontaneously is definitely considered an important sign of progress in the practice. And this is talked about in several verses here in the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra. And the next verse after this, verse 68, is the first of 3 verses on sexual practice, or rather, more accurately, working with sexual energy. And 68 is a fascinating verse. It's in code. It's very difficult to decode, and it took me quite a bit of time to decode it. So definitely stay tuned for that verse. Om. Thank you all. Nice to be with you on this journey.